After the incident at Fort Necessity in 1754, immediately began the world's first true global conflict. And it started in North America, and its epicenter was in North America. It would eventually reach other corners of the world, but its impacts would be devastating for one major colonial power and a reinforcement of another. The war in 1754, in American history, we know as the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's known as the 7 Years' War, even though technically it lasted 9 years. There were 3 phases to this new conflict that began in North America. First and foremost, even though it would become a global war, it actually began in North America. It was largely centered around North America. And influencing the conflict itself were Native Americans. Now, I mentioned the Iroquois tribe a little bit ago about how they had their own agenda. They largely kind of remained neutral. Most other Native Americans did not remain neutral. Most other Americans wanted to drive one of these European powers out of North America. Okay, they weren't crazy about both of them being there, but one of them in particular was reasonably friendly. Okay, well, which one do you think that is? I mentioned earlier that the British saw Native Americans really more as savages and a nuisance, whereas the French saw them as trading partners, business partners, perhaps Catholic converts, but no pressure. They treated them with dignity like human beings. The overwhelming majority of Native Americans outside of the Iroquois Confederacy sided with the French. And they saw them as being the far lesser of two evils. And maybe they can deal with one European entity, but 2 of them, that's not good. Okay? So, yeah, there were some Native Americans who did not side with the French, but the overwhelming majority of them did. Okay? So, that was one phase, and many of these Indian villages would get caught in the midst of the conflict, as did British settlements in the Ohio Valley, where many of these battles occurred in the onset, forcing British colonials east of the Allegheny Mountains. Okay? So you had a frontier withdrawal, if you will. The second phase began with William Pitt. About 2 or 3 years into the war, William Pitt became overall commander of British forces in North America. Later on, William Pitt would become the Prime Minister of Britain. But in this conflict, he had been Secretary of State, and the first few years of the war were kind of tenuous. By the time he took over, he revamped the British effort to establish control in North America. And one of his strategies was to not just appoint commanders who would have more of a firm view and grasp of military tactics, but he began a process of impressment. That is a forced enlistment into the British Army. So he would impress British colonials in North America into service for the British Army. That's kind of like a draft, but not like a draft at the same time. Whether you want to or not, and it's not random, you are going to serve in the British Army, and you're going to war against the French, who we are trying to kick out from this area. Okay, so you have other officers and other servicemen who would take resources from colonial farms. Many colonists were forced to shelter and quarter British troops. Okay, so you'll have something called the Quartering Act later on. You'll also notice that in the Bill of Rights later on too. Foreshadowing. What you saw from the colonials as many men and sons in the British colonial region were impressed into British service. Colonials were forced to house British troops, largely against their will. The British military would forcibly take supplies, food, crops from colonial farms and use them for their service. largely without compensation, by the way. So it's one thing if the federal government were to tell you, okay, student, where you live, you're going to be forced to house your neighbor. We're consolidating houses. Oh, by the way, we're not going to pay you anything extra for it. That would upset you, wouldn't it? Unless you have a very attractive neighbor that you really like and she's really... Never mind. I digress. Otherwise, though, the colonials were very hesitant in the second phase of the war because they saw all these things going on. Impressment? You're taking all my crops and supplies and now you're forcing me to house British troops? We didn't cause this. You did. Back home, you guys caused this. This isn't us doing this. Back home, you guys are doing that. But you're forcing us into it. Okay? So, William Pitt understood that most colonials saw his second phase actions as being overbearing so as to gain control. So he started to relent quite a bit, and he started to relax many of these policies that he enacted. And one of the things he did was, okay, he would agree to reimburse colonials for their troubles. Okay? So if they were if he had stuff requisitioned by the British Army, they could be resupplied. They could be paid back. It's kind of like in the coronavirus era. The government is shutting everything down. You can't go to bars, can't go to restaurants. You're not going to go get your hair cut. You're not going to do this. Everything's shut down. We're trying to keep the virus from spreading, right? Remember in the early days of the pandemic, you got to flatten the curve. We got to shut everything down. Okay. In the meantime, that's going to have a disastrous effect on the economy in various different ways. The least the federal government can do is offer us a check to help us pay rent, or maybe have small businesses get a loan or some sort of grant to keep them afloat, for at least for the time being. To this day, in mid-September, we're still talking about different phases of that. Imagine that, politicians in an election year not being on the same page while the rest of the country is struggling, but I digress. Otherwise, though, in order for Britain to win the war, they were going to have to first win over the colonials. Without the colonials, there is not going to be a victory. So you've got to make some concessions that are going to really help. Okay? And then instead of impressing colonials, he gave British troops regional authority in America to actively recruit as opposed to forcibly impress. So from that standpoint, you're going to gain more favor from people who would actually want to be there. And then, of course, in French colonies, many of them suffered through some drought-like situations that affected their crops and harvests, so they were struggling to feed some of their own troops. So, because now you had more of a unified British approach, and you had a struggling French army, within the first few years of the war, kind of a middling type environment became a more controlled environment to where the British now started to take over. They started to gain the upper hand. And over the next few years, it would become something to where, okay, this conflict is not going the way that we had expected. Now, elsewhere, this war reached certain parts of Europe. It would also have reaching effects in India, where the French still had some sort of colonial control, various different parts of the Caribbean too, but it was largely centered around North America. The writing would eventually come on, eventually be on the wall. And by 1763, the Peace of Paris Act was signed, or the Peace of Paris, basically a treaty to officially end the war, but it also laid out terms. This war, France would lose everything in North America. Okay? France, as a result of losing the war, would cede French Canada to the British, their arch rival. That's a bitter pill. They also lost the Great Lakes region and all their territory east of the Mississippi River all the way down, excluding Louisiana. They lost all that territory to the British as well. The Louisiana territory, New Orleans, they actually ceded to the Spanish. As the Spaniards had control of Florida and various different regions along the Gulf, they ceded to the Spanish. New Orleans, in that area of the Mississippi River, around modern-day Louisiana, basically, France ceded the title of all of their North American colonies. Great Lakes, Louisiana, and French Canada. That would be a massively bitter pill for the French to swallow. They were able to keep some of their Caribbean colonies, like modern-day Haiti, Saint-Domingue, some other regions around that area where you had a large slave population as well, especially as you had major sugar plantations around there. But otherwise, though, the war devastated the French North American colonies. And for Native Americans who sided with the French, now that would lead a lot of these Native Americans to now face reprisals from a colonial entity that they didn't side with, and now they're going to suffer even more greatly. So you have effects of this colony to where Native Americans did not fare well by the British winning. That was basically the beginning of the end, if there wasn't one already, for Native Americans. Okay, the British, they defeated their arch rival, the French. They defeated them. They gained all this territory in North America. They gained everything, control from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi River. Okay, that is a massive territory gain, and they also took control of Canada. They also received some territory in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, also in India itself, of which Britain already had a large empirical advancement there in the first place. Okay, so Britain's territorial claims in the New World vastly expanded. Okay, not only that, Britain itself became the preeminent colonial power in the world. Yeah, the French still had colonies elsewhere, but they took a major hit. The Spaniards had major colonies all throughout the Americas. They had started to lose a little bit of their luster by this time. Okay, the British, as a result of the French and Indian War, were the ones who became the preeminent European colonial power. And it solidified them as the dominant political power in Europe and in the world, really. Okay, they took notice that you colonials there in North America, you gave us fits when we tried to quarter our troops and we tried to help you win this war for you. We fought this war for you. But you gave us fits. We incurred this massive debt within which you did not help us pay. That's not good, colonials, you silly provincials. Yes, while Britain did gain significantly from the 7 Years' War, from the French and Indian War, they incurred massive amounts of debt in order to do it. So, it was their belief that, well, colonials, since this was a war fought to protect you and to expand for you, you should pay the debt. Really? Okay. I don't think so, Hoss. Yeah, we didn't start this. It was started here, but you guys did it. Why are we being held accountable for this. And the British saw this as a struggle waged for colonial benefit. And when they saw that the colonials in North America were giving pushback, the loose affiliations that the British would now have with the colonies would end. The Parliament back in England, back in Britain itself, decided, you know what? It's time we start really enforcing our authority in the colonies. This loose association, these lax laws and things that we have there, that's about to change because, you guys aren't all on board with us. We fought this for you, and you're giving us the middle finger. That's not going to happen anymore, you silly provincial colonials. So, the colonists saw this. Okay, wow. First of all, we are loosely affiliated. We're not on the same page. The Albany Plan basically exposed that. But one thing we all have in common, whether we're in Georgia or New England, we are all now under a microscope of Parliament, and they're going to flex their muscles to choke us into doing whatever they want and to organizing us in ways that they see fit. And they don't see it as us being colonials from Georgia or colonials from Virginia. They see us all together lumped as one. So what was a failure at the Albany Plan, a failure of disunity, now everyone in British North American colonies, whether you're in the Carolinas or New York, you now have a common reason for unification. Okay? So, what the French and Indian War did, it drove the French completely out of North America, damaged their colonial clout. It affirmed the British as being the world's preeminent colonial power, and it massively increased the size of their North American territory. It also massively increased the size of their debt, of which they forced the colonials to pay. It forced a iron fist from Parliament onto the colonies, which had the effect of unifying a disunified colonial North America. Hold that thought.